Good morning, adventurers. My name is Ben, and welcome to a morning show where I sit around, drink some tea, and talk about D&D. Mm. All right, first up in D&D news, we have no D&D news. um, Aside from, Strixhaven is coming out in less than a month now. So if you are looking to get that, make sure you get your pre-orders in now because there have been plenty of supply chain issues as we've gone throughout, ever here, especially during the pandemic. And as we get into the holiday season, you're going to want to make sure that you get your hold on it as early as possible. So make sure you go ahead and do that. Moving forward from news to streams, we have quite a few streams going on this weekend. So let's run through those as quick as we can here. Today, Friday, at 8:30 p.m. on twitch.tv/chromatic dice, you have Chromatic Dice playing, which is a D&D show that features a bunch of relatively prominent figures on D&D TikTok. At 10 p.m., Roll20Con has a game of Strixhaven, which is exciting, featuring Brennelly Mulligan, Mika Burton, Abria Iyengar, and Becca Scott. And they are playing for start playing, I want to say, which is really, really cool. And then at 11:30 p.m. on twitch.tv/DND, we have Acquisitions Incorporated over on the official Wizards channel. Moving on to Saturday at 4:30 p.m., we have Let's Get Wildmount on twitch.tv/DND, as well as at 7 p.m., Trace Albus at twitch.tv/DND as well. So if you've been keeping up with those, check it out. Also, all weekend on twitch.tv/This Show Is a Mimic, or This Show Is a Mimic, just sort of on wherever, there is a charity stream, or a series of charity games being run across the entire weekend. The one that I know most about is being run by good friend Miss Brooklyn Tuesday. She is running one tomorrow on Saturday. I don't remember exactly what the time is, but they should be posting a schedule relatively soon if you're interested in that. Then on Sunday, at 7 p.m. on twitch.tv/D&D, we have D4, as well as on Spotify on Sundays, Critical Fail DM and the Goons, the Strodcast, have been releasing episodes for the last couple weeks. There are only two of them out. Today we'll make three so far. So if you are looking for something to get into and stay up to date with, that is a great place for you to start. That is all of the streams that I've got for this weekend, which is a lot of streams for this weekend. So there you go. There's the verbal vomit of all of that stuff. Today for T&D, I am back in my Stone Creek coffee mug with the unicorn and the narwhal, which is just fun. It's wide and nice and a good time. And today I have a little bit of this stuff because, once again, I've been talking a lot recently. I don't know why. My job has just required me to be speaking quite often recently, and in high volume. So this is good for just like mellowing the throat back out a little bit. This is the licorice root, slippery elm bark, etc. that I talked about a lot before I started bringing them actually onto the show. But that is everything I have for the introductory part of today. Let's get into what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. I want to talk a little bit about constructing interesting and fun sort of little societies. Might not be the right word, but that's what I'm going to go with for right now, because it's not like a big world building concept that I want to go through. In fact, I really just want to kind of talk to you guys about how I have gone about designing a couple of the more interesting to look at from the outside societies and settlements that I have made in my games, whether or not the players have actually interacted with them. So let's go ahead and let's dive into that, shall we? Okay, so my first one that I really want to hit on is one that I have had. I've brewed it up a long time ago, and it's been kicking around in my head, and I've been working on it for a very long time. And it actually kind of like goes in two diverging paths, which is interesting to me. And they have both become sort of their own thing as time has gone on. So the way that I like to do this is I like to start with a concept, right? I like to just come up with something. That's it. I like to come up with something, and then I go from there. And so This one actually was inspired by when I was doing some research for how to populate a jungle in the first game I ever ran. Not like the first session I ever ran, but the first campaign that I ever ran. I was trying to figure out the best way for me to populate a dungeon. Or not a dungeon, a jungle. And so I was looking through the monster manual and I was like, man, there's quite a few like giant things, like giant eagle, giant owl, giant, like, I was like, okay, interesting. So if everything here is going to be giant and we make things like bigger, larger than life, and we go almost like Star Wars with it, where we go to like Kashyyyk, for example. If you're a Star Wars fan, you know what that means. If you're not, it's the Wookiee home planet. The ones with the giant trees. So I was like, okay, what if these trees are like, double redwoods essentially, like twice as wide, twice as tall, crazy big, and we put all of these giant things in them, but they are normal size compared to everything else around them, except for the like people that have come back to that place. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And so naturally from that, I sort of followed with like, okay, well, if that is the case, then there must be some people who have worked to tame some of these giant creatures. And that right there was sort of like the kicking off point for this concept that I have for these like little settlements throughout the jungle here. Because in D&D, there are plenty of small races, right? There are your gnomes, your halflings, your goblins. Most anything can be turned into a small race if need be. So there are these little people who are like, up to 4 feet tall, maybe a touch taller than that. And then you've got all of these giant creatures who are like blown up versions of normal things. Like a giant eagle is a large creature, whereas a normal eagle would be considered small on a good day. Usually it'd be considered tiny. So naturally, these people have like tamed these creatures, right? And at that point, I was like, well, why am I stopping at the monster manual with like eagles and stuff? Why wouldn't I go with something that is. They probably started with something that was dumber, right? And so I was like, okay, well, let's get some giant hornets or giant bees or something like that, or some ants. And then I was like, okay, well, what can you do that? So this was an idea that sort of like built on itself and built on itself and built on itself. And I'm going to give you guys just kind of a quick rundown of generally what it is, so you can kind of see, hopefully, the progression that I went through given that thought process that I just described. So this is actually split up into several different little settlements throughout the entire jungle. The jungle sort of spans a continent at this point. At least in my head, I've picked it up and moved it to different worlds that I've been using because I just sort of really like the concept. The idea is that there's this network essentially of settlements that is connected via this craft that they have, where they are animal tamers, friends of nature, that sort of thing, and they sort of spread themselves out across this lush jungle that has been largely untapped because it's dangerous for other people to come into. There are those of them that have sort of befriended the flying insects, flying creatures of the area, so they live high up in the trees. Some of them might even live in like hive-like structures because they've adopted that sort of thing from the main creature that they have sort of tamed and taken into their circle. There are some of them that live deep underground, way away from everything else, because they have sort of fostered this relationship between ants or moles or something like that, something that digs and lives deep under the surface of the world. But they have all remained connected because they're all becoming sort of like this integral part of this ecosystem, wherein they are essentially protectors of the forest, and because they are protectors of the forest, the actual like spirit of nature helps keep them interconnected there, right? And that to me is just a really cool concept, because that is like the people and nature living in harmony kind of thing. And so that is the first direction that this path in my brain has sort of taken down. Now the other one went, big creatures with little people. What about big creatures with normal sized people? And then I went, we can probably make that happen. And so the next one is actually one of my favorite ones that I have gotten to explore very briefly one time in game. and it was a lot of fun to actually get to interact with. Um, there is no reason that they're in this super fancy magical land of mystery and, arcanum. There's no reason that there cannot be giant ancient creatures, right? Dragons effectively are immortal unless they're killed. Effectively. Um, so there's no reason that other things cannot be the same way. Especially because there are things like that, lobsters, in real life that actually kind of exist like that. And so the idea is that you take a seemingly innocuous creature. You don't want to do this with a dragon. You want to do it with something that is generally very docile, and you turn it into a civilization, right? So my two favorites with this one are there was one of them in this jungle area, and there's one of them under the ocean. Um, I had a pod of sea turtles, a pod of enormous sea turtles. We're talking like giant, giant sea turtles that had little bits, like they each had their own little section of a settlement sort of on the back and up into the shell area, because the people that had settled there had figured out a way to essentially build onto the shell of the turtle and build under the shell of the turtle without actually hurting said turtle. I know that that's not super possible, but again, magic, mystery, and arcanum, it makes most things possible, and you shouldn't question that. Um, but this pod of sea turtles that traveled together traveled so deep in the ocean that they never had to deal with like a lot of interaction with the surface world. The sort of like trade-off for this, because that is the nature of these sort of things, is that the people that live there defend whatever giant animal they are on from attacks, danger, whatever, because these things are docile creatures. They are not going to be able to protect themselves super well, especially at such a massive size. They are going to have plenty of weak spots, and that is where these individuals come in. And so they are hyper protective and hyper secluded because of the fact that they will see most anything coming at them as a threat. And that is one of those like societal things that just sort of arises from the circumstance that they are in, and that is an important thing to think about when you're building a location or a settlement as a dungeon master. So the other one that was up in the jungle was essentially in the shell of a giant snail. This one I was like, well, I guess this should probably be smaller people as well, or like pixies or something, because a full society settlement in the shell of a giant snail, that's going to be a massive snail, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's going to be a lot harder to maintain by nature of the fact that the snail is going to be like a mile tall, and people are going to notice that. So that one's for like littler people, but like deep in the ocean, you can do whatever you want. The same concept sort of applies, though. There's going to be plenty of weak spots on this snail. The people that live inside of it or around it are going to be responsible for actually defending the snail. And part of that defense is allowing it to become this older creature. Actually, the sea turtles had, the settlement on the sea turtles had developed a magic that allowed them to effectively perpetually create a breathable sphere around, or not necessarily around. It wasn't like a bubble around all the turtles, but like in an area around the turtles, everything that needed oxygen and regular air to breathe could breathe, including the turtles. So this was sort of like a magical feature that they had developed over the course of several decades, centuries, etc., depending upon how long it would have been until they had actually interacted with it. And so those are two directions that original concept could kind of diverge in terms of like building up these societies, which are kind of interesting to me. The next one, not the next one, the other like starting idea that I want to talk about is another one that kind of diverged, but it kind of didn't. It was weird. It came to me in a very weird moment. I was standing outside looking at a lighthouse, and I went, okay. And so this idea is the idea that there is not a ton. I understand Storm King Cylinder exists, I promise. There's not a ton of like good examples of established giant, areas, it being like literal giants. And so my brain went, "Ooh, what can we do with that? What can we do with that?" And so I started with the giant creatures again. I was like, what if these giants exist in a society where they are entirely normal in their own minds? They do not know anything about the outside world. They don't know anything about these like little people that run around the world and everything like that. And so I came up with this settlement that is relatively well secluded, who have developed their own sort of lifestyle, culture, that sort of thing, where they cultivate and farm giant versions of creatures. So, like a giant goat or a giant sheep, which don't necessarily exist in the monster manual. Giant goats do. But, like, you can conceive of, hey, why not? They keep these animals, and they are normal size to them, and they don't think anything of it until maybe one day when the party wanders in, and there are these people who come up to, their ankle or their mid calf or something like that, and they're suddenly very confused by it. That just seems like a fun sort of idea to me, for these people to walk in and be like, "Oh, this is so strange because this is gigantic to me, but totally normal for all of them." And in the same sort of vein, this one is less of a society and more of like a particular NPC maybe that the party can interact with. It is a giant essentially that owns a normal sized zoo, or not normal sized zoo. The creatures in the zoo are normal sized, but the space that it occupies is much larger, and it can occupy and own and keep this zoo because it can travel so much faster and further than anything else would be able to. And so there's, in my head now, at least, this giant that travels around with his zoo, or he doesn't travel around with the zoo. He lives with his zoo, and people travel to come see it, which is a wild, wild concept because you don't really get a whole lot of zoos and that sort of thing in D&D. You get a lot more like festivals, carnivals, weird animal shows. But I always like to throw a zoo in there because I think it's a lot more fun. But anyway, that is the end of what I have to talk to you guys about today. Just a little bit about like taking an idea and running with it to see where you end up in terms of building out a society or settlement of some kind. I'm sorry, the dog is under the desk again. He's bumping everything around. But thank you guys so much for tuning in and making me part of your morning routine. I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much in particular to my patrons. You guys are the ones that really make this show possible. There is a link to my Patreon in the description of this video if you are able to and want to support the show. I really would appreciate it. We are so close to the goal to be able to push this show as a podcast as well. So if you are able to, please check that out. You might be the one that pushes us over the top on that. But as I mentioned, that is everything I have to talk to you guys about. Have an awesome weekend. I will see you guys on Monday. And until next time, keep on rolling.